As you're watching this documentary, the first thing we'd like to say is thank you. This project has been our passion. This will go through the recent history, documenting the rise of the podcast. We'll start at the very beginning, way back in the 1980s, when podcasting first started. But back then, it was called audio blogging. This is well before the advent of the World Wide Web. In the 1980s, RCS, or radio computing services, provided music and talk-related software in a digital format. And in the early 1990s, we now started to have radio-style talk shows, but on the computer. And in 1993, Carl Malleman launched Internet Talk Radio, which was the first computer talk radio show, each week interviewing a computer expert. It was described as audio files that computer users fetched one by one. We have to say, what a super snappy name that is. Now, downloading music did not reach critical mass until the launch of Napster, and this helped the mass media get used to the idea of downloading what we want, when we want it. In 2001, Albion Technologies of San Francisco introduced Replay Radio, later renamed Replay AV. This was like a TiVo recorder, but for internet radio shows. The best feature was a direct download link, which would scan the radio publisher's sites for new files and copy them directly to the user's hard disk. The first radio show to publish in this format was Web Talk Guy's World Radio Show, produced by Rob and Dana Greenlee. Web Talk Guy's World Radio, produced by Rob and Dana Greenlee, was one of the first podcasts ever produced. Have you ever heard of it?
No, I hadn't. This was actually the first time I'd heard of this. My first podcasts that I listened to were actually with Ziff Davis and the One Up Network. So that was the One Up Show. That might actually be the name of it. It was the one presented by Garnet Lee at the time with Shane Bettenhausen. That and GFW Radio, both of which were Ziff Davis podcasts, and they were both absolutely fantastic and introduced me to a new kind of version of game journalism, a new way of covering games that was conversational, but had a sense of humour. It wasn't as dry as the kind of more serious magazines, it wasn't industry focused, but it wasn't childish like a lot of the other magazines were, or at least that was my experience. I mean, I'd been out of the UK for 5 years at this point. I was living in Japan, so the media that I followed wasn't really... I hadn't been keeping up enough with the media, so my kind of idea of what it was at that point, and I guess it was about that time things were changing over to new game media, so I was very much coming back to it at the same time that game media was growing up. So that was my first experience with podcasts, and I'd really been focused on gaming before, after, and since.
Okay, let's move on to the podcasters then. When was your first recording session?
When was my first recorded session? I just looked this up. It was the first ever podcast that went up on my site at the time, my blog, which is still active, strangely. Even though I haven't posted on, I say active, it's still out there. It hasn't been published on for over a year. It was on 16th of August 2008 was when the first one went up, so you can assume a few days before that. And it was actually me and a good friend of mine, Darren, who pushed me into doing the blog. Push kind of gently, asking me basically, I was living in Japan, he said, what do you want to do when you get back? And the podcast I'd started listening to, it wasn't reading the sites or anything, it was the podcast that made me realise that I wanted to be in games media, that it was something that had grown up with me and it hadn't stagnated, as for some reason in my mind I thought it had. So I started the blog, which was, every post was 150 words on the dot, and that was a nightmare. But freer than that was the podcast I was doing with Darren. He was in the UK and I was in Osaka, Japan, and I was doing coverage from there, and he was asking me questions, and each of us recorded locally, so two Audacities running at the same time, and we plugged those together. So the audio quality was still high, despite the distance between us.
And why did you start a podcast?
Why did I want to start a podcast? I think I probably touched on this. It was down to the fact that I thought it was a far more natural and entertaining way of putting across opinions, because obviously when you've got two people in the discussion, you've got something to bounce off. And Darren and myself, we've been friends for years. Darren's currently doing Read Out of Memory and producing beautiful books. Just going to plug in. He did the Sensible Software book and the Mega Drive book, both of which he published through his own site. But so he's in the UK doing all this, and he was and that's important actually. I mean, it's not just a throw in there, because he knew all about the retro stuff and he was in the UK, and I was far more up to date in Japan. So we were having these interesting discussions, like almost bringing him up to speed on what gaming had become, and at the same time me finding out what gaming was in the UK, because I was in this weird bubble. But yeah, the reason we wanted it is partly because it was a really natural way to cover things, especially when we were good friends. And equally, it was a good excuse for me to just have like an hour's talk with Darren every fortnight, because it was something we wouldn't have found time to do otherwise. So it was a good way of sharing these natural discussions. And it was also, I thought, a really good way to start getting content other than just my writing on the site. And the site was there as a portfolio, so when I came back I'd be able to go into other things and more professional things, and the more kind of media I could get in there, the better.
When did you feel you were comfortable on the microphone?
Feeling comfortable on the mic was never really an issue for me. From partly this is because obviously I was doing it from another country and just had my headphone on, and that was about the extent of my kind of interaction with it. I just strapped that on, and then I was talking to my co-host Darren, so I was talking to a friend for long periods of time, and that, I suppose, that set me up well for later podcasts when I've done talking to other people. The only thing that really became an issue in that equation, of course, with Darren, and less so with Darren because I did know him so well, I'm very familiar with his pauses, with his breaks. It was far more of a problem when I started like bringing other people onto the show, because the nature of the pauses, knowing when somebody's natural cadence brings them to a finish and when you should jump in, was a lot more challenging. But with Darren it was never a problem, so I felt comfortable on the mic from day one, and then kind of discomfort sprang up later on when suddenly I was dealing with other people. It's going to be a problem I run into soon actually, because my current company doesn't have a podcast, but thinking of starting it, and I am most of the time in Barcelona for that, and they're going to be in San Francisco, so it's going to be different times of the day, which does impact the way people are reacting to things, especially when you're on different ends of that, and there's going to be no way of seeing them through most of that, so there's going to be a new learning experience getting used to those pauses and things.
Why do you enjoy creating podcasts?
I've always enjoyed talking. And I guess that's kind of goes with the territory. I mean, I've always felt comfortable doing it, and by extension I've always enjoyed that part of the podcasting. Where things always get a little bit tricky is if you feel that something needs editing. I remember painstakingly going over the first 15 or 16 episodes I ever recorded, cutting out all those breaks, like that was a long pause, maybe we don't want that in there, and eventually you reach a point where you know what needs editing out, and the trial that presents, the editing process either becomes more fluid, or you just become a bit freer and you know what you need to and don't need to cut. Certainly I have strived always when I'm editing since that point to come up with just cleaner content. If other people are editing them, whatever, I'll just enjoy the talking. But I have always enjoyed doing it, and the kind of I realised that if you have a good show, if the content's good, you don't need to be slicing out everything. And at that point, the whole process just became more enjoyable, and I've enjoyed it. I enjoyed it at the time, but I've enjoyed it even more ever since, just having a better idea of what's necessary in a podcast and the best way to kind of put them together, and realising that you don't need one long, unbroken speech with no pauses because you've gone through meticulously taking them out. It's not necessary.
What is the worst thing you've ever said in a podcast?
What's the worst thing I've ever said that's gone up forever? Now, I overshare, I talk a lot, and I guess, but by the same token, I'm not really that precious. The biggest thing that I've ever found problems with is where you and somebody are going somewhere with something, and or just you are going somewhere with a topic, and the person you're podcasting with just doesn't come on that journey with you, and suddenly it just gets all awkward and kind of like silent. So you're sat there like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have brought that up, or and by extension of that, you can go somewhere with somebody and it can be a joke, and you know each other's limits. But if it goes up, it's not necessarily going to be appropriate, not because of any held value, but because jokes don't necessarily come off correctly when you don't know the people, and you can't be sure other people are going to know everybody. You can hope that everybody gets things in the right light. But I guess the biggest thing that I've ever said that actually ended up going up that I can recall was the time that I admitted to the fact that one time I was on vacation in Florence and I couldn't get my zip down on my trousers, and we were all busting for the toilet, and I just kind of peed myself a little. Which I guess in retrospect I'm not that precious about. It's a bit of a weird story though, and it was completely out of nowhere on the show. It was just because I was chatting to Darren. Yeah, sometimes personal stuff goes up that perhaps not inappropriate, not really even that embarrassing to me, because things happen when you're young, but yeah, a bit out of nowhere.
What has changed with the equipment since you started podcasting?
How has my equipment changed since I've been podcasting? Now, you might not get this from what I'm doing right now. Currently, I'm sat in my room in the UK, and I don't live in the UK anymore, because what actually ended up happening was I got the request to do this part of the documentary, to contribute to this documentary. I got it through a month or so ago, and I was like, right, one day I set aside a chunk of time and I recorded it all, did it all really nicely on, and this does play into it. I just got a nice Blue Yeti microphone. Previously I'd just been using a cheap Logitech headset, and I moved on to the Alex Beech PX21 headset, and like the quality goes up at each stage in that equation. But right now I'm recording this on a DSLR with a built-in microphone, because it never dawned on me that a podcast documentary would be done in video form, which I know is just, it's me assuming, and why wouldn't it be on video? I mean, it's just as easy to capture. But I guess I figured if you're doing something about audio, the result would be in audio, but it's not. So generally I now actually podcast with the PX21s I mentioned on my head, and the Blue Yeti in front of me, which is a fantastic quality mic. I mean, you've got all the nubs and buttons on it that you can tune, so you're lowering the gain on the mic, and you can do obviously post editing on top of that. Generally I use Audacity to capture the pure audio and then worry about the rest after that. But we did get around a lot of the issues at the time, because even when I started I had like I said, a cheapy headset. I don't think I ever used the internal mic. I have on occasion when I've been either capturing out in the field, as it were, sounds more rough and tumble than it is, or occasionally having like an omnidirectional mic, because there's more people in a room than you have than one mic will pick up, than your headset mic will pick up. But for the most part it's been a slow progression through from cheap headsets to this kind of new fancy setup I've got. Unfortunately right now that's not what we're on, because I wasn't expecting this to be video.
For content creators, do you think it's a better medium than YouTube or Patreon?
Do I think podcasting is a better option than other multimedia things for content creators like YouTube? It's different. I mean, you can't, they're incomparable in many ways. And I think, and this perhaps speaks more to me, like I watch a lot of YouTubes, I watch a lot of Netflix, I watch a lot of Twitch with it behind other windows. Like I listen far more than I watch. I'm always doing something else, constantly. I mean, I find it at this point in my life, and this is perhaps a damning indictment of me as a person really, I find it really a real struggle to focus all of my attention on one thing, unless you sit me in a cinema and turn all the other lights off and like do it. So podcasts for me are just a really good way of having information, because the people on the other end know that you're not getting any other information. So I will quite often, while I will quite often just listen to videos, podcasts are obviously the best option there, because they cover everything, all the other information that you might miss. It's a very different thing though to people who are streaming, YouTube, all of the other options out there, because they do provide visual. And obviously, I mean, I cover a lot of gaming, and the visuals can be incredibly important to that. Let's plays, live streaming the first how many minutes of game. If that's what you're looking for, you need the visual. But it's not necessarily something that I focus on, and I think they're equally good, but for very different reasons. And for me, podcasts are the best, but for people who perhaps want to see what a game looks like, rather than like I am now in a place where I will buy any game that I feel I'm interested in, because that gives me a chance to talk about it, and if I've watched a load of stuff about it at some point, that muddies my opinion. So I think I'm in a place where podcasts are probably my favourite form of media, of getting my information, but I think for a lot of people that's not the case.
For people just starting out, what advice would you give?
What advice would I give to podcasters? Two bits of advice. One, you don't really need anything when you're starting up. You need something. You need a computer to record it on, Audacity, which is free, and a cheap mic. I mean, you're talking about £10-15 for a decent mic, an okay mic that's going to be close enough to your face that it's going to pick up decent audio quality, but equally far enough away from your face that your moustache doesn't keep hitting it. Might not be an issue for everybody, of course. Now, the other thing that I'd say is, as with my kind of guideline for everything that I put online, generally, is that it needs to be something that you would be happy to yell across a room of people that you don't really know. I'm not a huge fan of doing things for shock value. It has its place sometimes, generally in comedy. If you're doing something in a kind of serious way, do consider what you're saying. Do remember that anybody could hear this ever, and present yourself accordingly. Hopefully you're somebody that has a fairly nice demeanour anyway. As long as you're putting out interesting quality material that you would be interested in, people will come to that. It'll build a pace. My first podcast started off quite slow, started off quite quietly, and then it built an audience as we got better at doing it, and poured more and more effort in. It's a shame we couldn't have continued, actually, because we were starting to get good viewing figures near the end, and I sullied that with specials that weren't as good a quality as when me and Darren were doing them. But the ultimate message is, if you feel you can sit and talk and provide engaging conversation, there is absolutely no reason not to start right now with what you've got at home, because you probably have everything you need.
They've become very popular. Why do you think that is?
Why have podcasts become popular? I think I touched on this before, actually, when I was talking about why I prefer them to things like YouTube, and that's not a statement that I would make for everyone, but they can be taken in at all times. I mean, at this point, pretty much everyone has some device that they can just put in their pocket and plug a headset into and get their information when you're on the move. Well, there's two other sides to that. One, it can be taken anywhere. It's like radio. You can be doing multiple other things while you're taking that information, and because the people producing it know you're not looking at anything, know there's no additional information to be taken in, they make sure they give you everything you need within the audio presentation. So while TV and things can be good to have on in the background, they're not providing everything you need if you want everything that's going on. The other side of it is that at this point, podcasts are frequent enough that you actually start to build a relationship with the people on there, providing they're good and they put themselves across in a very natural way. After the one-up, the Ziff Davis studios closed and GFW radio closed, I moved on to, and this was a little bit of a break, because obviously it was after Jeff Gerstmann had been fired from GameSpot, gone off and started off Giant Bomb. The Giant Bomb show I kind of gravitated to, and I was there pretty much from the start listening to it. And at some point in all of that, and kind of tragically, obviously I only ever knew him through listening to the podcast and all of their videos, Ryan Davis passed away, and I realised that for all of the media celebrities that I do obviously see in my life, the world around me, that was the first one that had ever impacted me personally, and that was because I felt like I knew him because I saw him all the time. And that's how podcasts can be so powerful, because you are literally, I mean, while you're talking to your friends in a room, while you're talking to your colleagues in a room, everyone's hearing what you're like, and it becomes far closer than most other media, because it's there, it's in your ear, it's like having, and because the way podcasts are, they are conversations, you feel like you're part of that. You're not being presented to in the same way news and talk TV shows do. It is a dialogue, it's a conversation going on around you that by extension you feel like you're part of.
What's your most memorable topic you've ever recorded?
The best topic I've covered. I only really cover games, so the importance of it all gets a little bit washed away. It's all entertainment and all things like that, and I guess where it comes down to, I'm not sure I can remember a precise one, it's when I get passionate about things. I mean, and I guess this was one of the issues I ran into in my early podcast. When I was starting out, I had lofty ideas about what games should be, and I did a lot of, like, all of those Are Games Art posts. Not quite like that. I knew they were art in the right places, and like feelings in games, stuff like that. And some of those could have been great, except Darren kept my feet on the ground because he always told me how pretentious I was being, which was a great thing because it stopped the podcast, it stopped me lecturing on the podcast, which can always be a worry, especially when you've got that distance between you and I'm not getting the eyes from the other people I'm talking to, the presenting with, that are just saying like, God. But I guess the best ones we've had since, I think in recent times, the most interesting topic I think that's come up repeatedly has been Nintendo and their kind of reliance on their franchises, because I am a huge fan of the company, but the only games I'd say at this point I really have any time for are Zelda and Metroid. I'll play the Marios, absolutely, the Mario kind of core Mario titles, but the other people that I present with on one of the blogs that I'm involved with, Opposable Chums is the name of the website, and Touching Sticks is the name of the podcast that I'm currently on quite regularly. I'm bored out of my skull with things like Pokemon, and especially when they're just re-releasing them at this point. It feels like a cash grab in a way a lot of their other more measured, their main core titles don't. So we get into some pretty heated and interesting discussion because I tend to be on the other side of the fence to them, and it's probably because I'm 10 years older. Like, it'll be interesting to see how their opinions change once they've got 10 more years of playing the games. Yeah, that's going to be interesting to see. But right now, I think that's the one I probably get. I think is the best topic because we get so heated, and that's again the key. Like, passion is what will carry any topic through.
What's the worst topic you've ever talked about?
So I guess the converse, the best topic is the worst topic. And again, there's a difference between the worst topic and the worst result. Like, I think the worst topic, well, I don't even know really, because as long as you have a good discussion, you can find a good topic in anything. I guess the worst ones we had were, like I said before, when I'd go all kind of, our games art, which is still a topic I quite like to have the discussion about, but with somebody that didn't. So Darren, we kind of got to this point, it was like, yeah, it doesn't really matter though, does it? Because I guess ultimately it doesn't, but it's a fun discussion to have for me, but not if the other people aren't prepared to come on the journey. Incidentally, like, I think that he just thought it wasn't a good discussion to have between the two of us because we're actually on the same page, which is another thing. You do need every side of the discussion if you're going to have that talk. I guess the worst topic that we kind of snatched out of the air ever that kind of failed, that I felt should have succeeded, was a discussion we were having about video games that have been turned into movies, or that way around, that's right. And I was the only one of the three people in the discussion that had really watched a stack of them. So if people aren't informed, you just end up with a bad show. There is some preparation needed. If you were watching, like, on that note where I mentioned, like, just put your headphones on and talk. Like, prepare beforehand. I mean, it's not just you slap on a set of headsets. You need to know the topics, you need to have some idea. So a little preparation is required. So as long as you're prepared and the topic is, there's enough there to talk about, you can have a good topic. The ones that have failed have been because we were either too closely meshed in terms of opinions that it wouldn't be an interesting discussion, it would just be a lecture, or when only one of us knew, so they were kind of explaining everything, and at some point, while the explanation is important, if that's all that's happening, it just doesn't work.
What has been your favorite episode of your podcast so far?
Best podcast I produced was probably middle of the era when I was doing Doofus. I mean, at that point we had, lordy, we split into, I think we got it down to about 40 minutes at the kind of longest. It was broken into 3 or 4 parts, including, or not including, a couple of special segments. So we'd start and just like a hello, and then what we've been playing, with news, then what we've been playing, and like maybe a topic. But interspersing that, we would have a song challenge where each of us produced tunes based on famous video games. We'd have an introduction along with the theme music that Darren had put together. Now, bear in mind, he did a lot of the audio production. He was quite gifted at such things, riding on his coattails for some of that. I did the preparation in terms of content, or spoken content. And then we had Darren's old games, which was him just basically rapping about the most bonkers of old games. I remember one of my favourite ones was when he discussed his favourite Mario game in history, and he said Mario game 56, and he had a list of every Mario game produced in order, and it was Mario Paint, which was only ever released in Japan. Was it Mario Paint or Mario Paint 2? Anyway, Mario Paint did come out elsewhere, but and that was his whole game. That's what he picked that week. And then he did one about all the Sonic games, where he basically said they were all bobbins, because quite frankly they kind of did turn into that at the point he was talking about them. But yeah, that was the best we ever produced, and it was because we had a format that we stuck to, we had good conversations, and then we added a lot of well-produced stuff around it. And it was snappy, which with only 2 people is kind of necessary. I mean, you can have kind of interesting conversations over time. If you've got a bigger group, you can have that longer form podcast, but if you're only looking at a couple of people, you need something to transition to stop it just being 2 people having a chat.
What's the best question you've ever been asked, or you yourself have asked?
Right, what's the best question I've ever asked or been asked? Now, I guess there's 2 answers to this question. I haven't done many interviews in my time on camera, or on mic, I should say. The biggest one that actually ended up being a video, not a podcast, was when I got to talk to Suda51. It was around the time Killer is Dead came out, and while everybody else was going in there asking about the sexism in the game, which for some reason he still felt compelled to address with me at some point during the interview. What I was really interested in, what I got to ask about, and I think he was quite relieved to not have all the focus on the fact that there were a lot of women in his game that weren't perhaps as well dressed as they should have been, was how he created his mix of Asia and America in his game, his Japan and America fusion, because they are in a very set world, they're in a very specific time and place, but how that world, he arrived at that world, because he's got this very specific view of America that is very unique within all of that kind of series of games. In the Killer 7, Killer is Dead, and No More Heroes, all of those are quite beautiful to look at and quite unique, but I basically got to quiz him on how he came to it. And it was very much like how when he's travelled to America, he's only spent kind of limited periods of time there, and obviously when he goes back it's kind of flavoured with his world. The other questions I got to ask that I always enjoyed were when I was doing the Doofus podcast with Darren, and occasionally he as my co-host would pretend to be Jonathan Frakes as we called him, or alternatively Will Riker from Star Trek The Next Generation, and he'd come on and he would pretend to be Will Riker with this peculiar accent that was not American in any way, and I got to ask him questions. And the one episode, he was currently starring in a reboot of Bigfoot and the Hendersons, a pornographic reboot of Bigfoot and the Hendersons, and he was Bigfoot, and he was talking about how he actually had to shave down for the role because he was just too hairy to be a Bigfoot, and I got to quiz him about that, and that was perhaps my favourite set of questions in interviews, even though it wasn't real. Don't worry, there's no pretense it was real. If you look back on it, it was obvious what it was.
What is the worst question you personally have ever been asked?
The worst question I've ever asked or been asked, haven't really had one. Again, I tend to be quite comfortable chatting. The only time we've really run into awkward moments, like if it's a group of us talking who are friends and at some point you cross a line that people don't necessarily want to discuss on air. If you're literally just having a laugh around with each other, sometimes you stray across that line naturally, like you would in a bar, say, and you're fine with it, except you don't want to give the answer, and that's when you run into the awkward moment. I don't think I've ever had any interview that I've gone into with people that I'm not familiar with, because I'd always prepare, and I'm not somebody, as I've said before, I'm not somebody who goes in for shock value, so I'm not going to go out there with some question that's completely not going to work. The only time something like that would happen would be if they themselves were not having a good day, and then even then I don't think I necessarily think the question was bad, more the response.
When you have a guest on your show, how do you prepare for an interview?
How do I prepare for interviews and guests? Simple process. Find out I know more than enough about them for something that's going to come up during a conversation. Now, obviously, most interviews, you very, very rarely get more than 5-10 minutes, and they're on a kind of a cycle through. I mean, occasionally you do, and occasionally I've been lucky enough to have a longer set of questions answered. Normally that's in written form. If it's something that's going to go on a podcast, unless you get them on the air there and then, as opposed to going out, meeting them and having it as an insert into the show, you tend to not need to know like their life story. You just need enough to keep the conversation going, and you need to know enough about their history to make sure that you can roll off the answers they give you in natural ways if you have any additional questions. And generally, I've been lucky enough for all the interviews I've given to be with people that I was already fascinated with so it was never something I had to research desperately. But of course, you do come up with a line of questioning. You think about why they might be giving the interview. For example, I was lucky enough to have an interview with John Hare at one point while I was working at Future, and that interview was at that time partly focused on the Sensible book that my friend put out, but also it's a good book, you should get it one way or the other. It was partly that, and it was also partly that he, after the fact, I wanted to get a little bit more of a run-on interview about what he's doing now, and that he was very focused on Word Explorer, which was the game that he was putting out. And you've got to know what people are up to, because that's going to be what they naturally want to talk about. It's not necessarily like pushing their product, that's not what I mean, but obviously in this industry, in gaming, people do what they're passionate about, and they're automatically going to want to talk about it. So by extension, you need to, if you want a good interview, you need to be able to go on that journey, so you need to know about it and have some questions prepared around it, because otherwise, if you're talking about their past, yes, they're going to be interested in it, yes, everybody's got an ego in that regard, but it's not what they're passionate about now, and you're always going to get a better interview if you're talking about what people love.
What topics do you hope to touch on in the near future?
Is there anything I wish I could have covered? Plenty. I mean, it's such a weird question. I mean, there's no way you find time to cover everything. Sometimes the other people in the room, sometimes the other people on the show just aren't on the same page as you. You don't want to do it by yourself. But I guess if you're looking at like truly missed opportunities, it's when I haven't had the equipment with me to do something in a timely fashion, or I've seen that kind of little possibility. Like I got drunk, sat next to Sweary, who made Deadly Premonition, and Izakaya in Tokyo before Tokyo Game Show one year. Or if I could have got a mic on that conversation for 5 minutes, it would have been fantastic, because his broken English and my broken Japanese would have only led to comedy gold. Another time I had half a minute in front of Shinji Mikami of Resident Evil fame, and that is a series that I adore. So the opportunity to have just be able to just get my claws in there, and that's what it comes down to. It's about having the contacts. If I could have got that, then maybe I could have had an email conversation with him and secured, even if it was just a written interview, but just secure just a few questions on mic that I could have put up somewhere. That would have, forget if the answers had been any good, just the excuse to talk to him that little bit longer would have been incredible. So I guess, I guess there's things that I feel like I've missed. I don't think I've missed anything in terms of a topic. Maybe I haven't been timely enough, but I don't think there's anything out there that you can't cover on a podcast, and that's kind of the beauty of them. I mean, it is just talking. So the opportunities, the things that you miss, only come in terms of who you can get to be there with you for the coverage.
Were there any significant low points in your recording thus far?
Were there any significantly low points? That depends what you mean. Depends if you consider podcasting to be something I did on the side, or you consider it to be part of my profession. If you consider it to be something I did on the side, no, I've always enjoyed podcasting. There were times that, it was harder to get things together. The people were hard to kind of corral, to find the time to put everything together. If you're talking about professionally, yes, there are absolutely low points. Gaming, providing game coverage, games media is incredibly competitive, and I banged my head against that brick wall for what felt like a brick wall for 4.5 years before I got my first breaks professionally. I mean, I had minor highlights in the interim, but they never kind of bloomed into something that was sustainable as a career. And it was only in the last 6 months, 7 months, that that's really happened, and that's led to me moving country, changing my circumstances completely, and it's been fantastic. But it does depend on where you consider podcasts in that equation. I'm certainly at each stage in my games coverage, in my games media life, they've been there, and I'm bringing them into the company that I've just entered as something that they haven't done before. So that conversely would be a highlight, because if I can get that to stick, that'll be fantastic. But other than that, the lowlights have really been career focused rather than in podcasting.
Do you think that podcasts will continue to become more popular?
Do I think podcasts will continue to become more popular? Only as much as everything's going to continue to become more popular. There are just more people getting online, more people becoming literate. Yes, that is the right word. In multimedia. I mean, when podcasts first came out, they were adopted by a younger group, and then obviously they spread. But still, my mum doesn't quite get them. She's 60 something. But you're only ever knocking that up, and so at some point the people that started are going to be the very top band, and the people below are still going to be there. Will podcasting itself continue to be the same percentage? Possibly not. It might step off. I mean, obviously the bandwidth's going to increase, so people are going to be able to use videos more often. They're going to be able to take it if that's what they want. But I think there's still going to be a place, as I said right back at the start, the reason I love them is they replace radio, they replace storytelling, they come to you in a way that is non-invasive to other things you could be doing. You can still drive, you can still cook, you can still do multiple other things while listening to a podcast that you can't do with video. So there's always going to be a place, and it's going to expand as the number of people listening. Forget the age thing, extend beyond that as the number of people in the world with the technology to get it, obviously. I mean, developing markets, India's just got the new sub $100 Android phone. Suddenly that becomes an option if they're going to have, when they start to get the bandwidth to download that. So especially in English podcasts that are going to have this kind of burgeoning market, yes, you're going to see more downloads. Does that mean? Yeah, that does mean they're becoming more popular, but only because more people are being introduced to it. I think that the percentages between video and audio, streaming and consumption are going to remain about the same, but the audience is going to grow, which by extension means they'll become more popular, I guess.
And finally, how do you think podcasts must change to continue to be relevant in the future?
How will podcasts change in the future to be relevant? Now, as I said in the last question, I mean, you're going to be looking at new markets, new things like that. By extension, I think topic and language are going to become a huge factor. I mean, obviously, you know, people's priorities, people's interests are going to change as they get older. As a gamer, I'm still going to be interested in gaming, but I'm going to want other things brought into that. And if you're looking at something that you want to be extended into other markets, where English isn't necessarily the first language, but you feel there's a market there, you're going to need clearer conversation, maybe, clearer English. But the idea of what a podcast is, I don't necessarily think has to change. I think the thing that draws me back into the podcasts that I really enjoy on a regular basis are that they're conversational, they're inclusive, they make me feel like I'm part of the room, part of the conversation. And sometimes I'll mutter to myself in like disagreement if I'm hearing a conversation that I have a particularly strong opinion about. And I think that is what podcasts do incredibly well. I think messing with that could be quite denigrating to what it makes them special. There's the other side of podcasting, that's that kind of more radio produced side. Serial was very popular recently, obviously, and which is highly produced, like scripted, put together incredibly well, kind of documentary style, and other things like taken straight from the radio. And that's a different side of podcasting, and I think that's also incredibly valuable, but a very different niche. And I think there could be room for more of that, because obviously that does require more effort, does require more skill. And if you have good ideas that you have by yourself and you don't think work well as a conversation, I think more of that kind of highly produced, I've used the word lecture before, but perhaps it's actually accurate here, a kind of talk about what you're interested in, as long as it's presented well, and snappy enough. And that's always important, that you have that kind of hard and fast cuts, because it's hard to listen to somebody talk, as you're probably getting at the end of this 2-minute thing. It's hard to listen to somebody monologue for a length of time. You do need something to keep that snappy, or somebody else in there to discuss it, to play your role, the listener's role. You need somebody in there asking questions rather than it just be a university lecture.